France is famous, or rather infamous, for its bulky bureaucracy. The country is known to be a civil servant's paradise.
There are legions of the so-called fonctionnaires. It's a hot-button and divisive issue that causes huge fights between the left and the right, mainly over the size and the cost.
Attempts to reform the system have driven people into the streets and ground the country to a halt. So the big question is France ready for a change?
Join us for this episode of French Connections Plus, where we take a closer look at les fonctionnaires.
Je voulais pas donner non plus, je voulais donner en connaissance de cause.
France's public service, the so-called fonction publique, is huge.
Well, there are over 5.5 million civil servants in France, which means that 1 in 5 workers is on the state's payroll.
France has the most fonctionnaires in Europe, but when you scale it down to the size of the population, France is far from being the world champion.
Well, sure, we're ahead of Japan and Germany and the United States, but we're way behind Scandinavian countries.
So there are a lot of them, but just what is a fonctionnaire?
Well, fonctionnaire is a catch-all status that applies to a lot of different kinds of people. Now, contrary to popular belief, not all employees of the state have the status. For instance, people who work for the National Railway Service, the SNCF, or members of the military, or even journalists at France 24 are not fonctionnaires.
So if we're not fonctionnaires, who is?
Well, there are 3 branches of the civil service. You have public servants of the state, for instance, the police, or especially teachers. And then you have civil servants at the regional, departmental, and local level. And then you have public hospitals and all their staff, doctors and nurses, etc.
Essentially, fonctionnaires keep the country running and safe and the population healthy and educated. And for that reason, they're given a very special status with a lot of perks.
The stereotype goes that fonctionnaires are underworked and overpaid, which is an exaggeration, of course. But civil servants certainly have the reputation of being privileged compared to private sector workers, and this can lead to some jealousy. First of all, they're pretty much guaranteed employment for life. On top of job security, they tend to work fewer hours than in the private sector. They also tend to take more holiday, 42 days on average compared to 29 days of annual leave in the private sector. And what about salaries? Well, it depends on your pay grade. Managers in the public sector tend to be paid less than their counterparts in the private sector, while lower-skilled workers tend to be paid more. They also get generous sick pay, early retirement, and the best pension packages. Ask French parents what they want their children to be when they grow up, and many will reply without hesitation, a civil servant.
France's public service is the object of all kinds of rumors and fascination, and many of you sent in your questions, like Apriti Mukherjee, who said, "I want to know how civil servants are selected."
Well, to become a civil servant, you have to take a competitive exam that's called a concours, and this can take years of studying to prepare. That means that everyone has an equal shot, regardless of their background or connections. The idea is to have a corps of civil servants selected solely on their merit.
I have a question. How much does all of this cost?
Well, it costs quite a lot. In fact, about 24% of GDP goes towards funding France's public service. That's because the state pays for its current employees and the pensions of all its former employees, and this can add up. For instance, in 2014, the state paid about 280 billion euros in salaries, and on top of that, about 37 billion euros in pensions.
Critics say this mammoth bill just costs taxpayers too much money. But the real question is, how big a drain is the fonctionnaire system on the French economy?
To find out more about France's public service, I'm joined by Laura Marlowe, the correspondent for the Irish Times here. You've been living in Paris for quite some time, so you've seen this debate about les fonctionnaires flare up time and time again. Do you think the fonctionnaire bashing that we see is fair?
Yes and no. I've dealt with some civil servants who were wonderful, who were very devoted, very hardworking, very efficient. But I've also met some who were sadistic, wicked, useless. So like any profession, it goes both ways. They have, for a very, very long time, been the butt of jokes by people. One was that when France moved to the 35-hour working week in the beginning of the 2000s, people were joking that civil servants would have to increase their hours to reach 35 hours. But at the same time, opinion polls show that most French people actually like their civil service and they appreciate the civil service and think it is good.
Would you say that France's civil service is effective?
Parts of it are very effective. A lot of it is not. Part of the problem is that it's just expanded and expanded and expanded. And during the 3 decades of prosperity after the Second World War, the government had the money and they hired and hired and hired and hired. I think probably one of the biggest problems is that these people have job security. They cannot be fired. And I think that if civil servants were at risk of being fired, like people in the private sector, I think that would be a very good measure. I think they would shape up a bit.
And would you say that France is a nanny state? It's been described that way sometimes.
Yes. When you have become accustomed to having free medical care, free education, in many cases subsidized housing, you get used to that, and it's like an addiction, and the government can't take it away, or there will be mass unrest. It does a lot for its citizens, and not only does it do a lot for them in France, it does a lot for them abroad. For example, if you go hiking in the Himalayas and get lost, the French government will come and save you, which, arguably is a good thing, but it costs money.
Now, to tighten the belt, the French president Emmanuel Macron has vowed to slash the civil servants. He wants to cut 120,000 fonctionnaires. But which ones do you cut?
That's the problem. Most presidents promise to slash the civil servant, and then when they get in office, they don't know what to cut. It's very, very tricky because all of the ministries say that they're cut to the bone. Certainly the police are very hard-pressed since the jihadist attacks in 2015 and 16.
So not necessarily the police or the teachers
not
or
the police.
the
The teachers, they are not very motivated. And one argument is that you should hire more teachers, better teachers, and pay them better. There's a lot of question about whether doctors and nurses in all French hospitals should be civil servants. Should they really have civil servant status? That said, I'm not sure privatizing the health system is the answer either.
Do you think that the French, who are quite used to these wonderful public services, are they ready for change themselves?
They say they are. All of the opinion polls show that the French want reform. The problem is when it comes down to me and my interest. If you try to reform, it will always affect someone's personal interest, and then they turn against you. So in theory, it sounds great, but as long as it doesn't touch me.
Well, thank you so much, Laura. That's all we have time for, but thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Reforming the fonctionnaire system is so taboo because civil servants are ingrained in French culture. For example, the whole education system is geared toward maintaining the status quo.
Well, arguably the best school that you can go to in France is the National Administration School, l'ENA, which we've already explored on our show.
Many French presidents and other top officials went to that school, and so they're not really in a rush to change the system that spawned them.
And although they love to complain, French people also have a certain amount of respect for their civil servants because, after all, they're working for the greater good, ensuring that public services like education, healthcare, policing, and even diplomacy are high quality, accessible to everyone, and affordable.
So like many things here in France, the French have a love-hate relationship with their fonctionnaires. Flo, you went to find out more.
Personne aime les fonctionnaires.
Je pense que c'est plutôt privilégié quand même. Ils ont des boulots qui sont plutôt cool quand même.
Il y en a trop, hein, parce qu'avec la technologie, tout est virtuel maintenant.
Ça dépend des administrations. Vous avez des administrations où on peut considérer que le mammouth a dégraissé et d'autres administrations où on a un manque cruel d'effectifs.
Aujourd'hui, on se plaint qu'il n'y ait pas de travail, etc. Et si on s'amuse à supprimer des postes,
L'administration française, c'est un peu connu pour être un peu lent. Donc si on enlève en plus des postes, là, je crois qu'on va plus s'en sortir.
On a de la chance, on est dans un pays où on a quand même un bon service public, même si c'est vrai que c'est un petit peu lent parfois pour certains papiers. Mais bon, dans l'ensemble, ça va.
C'est excellent.
Que ce soit de la primaire jusqu'à la fac, les profs font beaucoup de grèves. Chaque année, il y a au moins une grève. Donc c'est qu'il y a un problème à l'intérieur du système. Et ça, c'est quelque chose qu'il faudrait régler, quoi.
Je pense que le service public est une institution qu'il faut éviter de trop critiquer. C'est surtout un service qui est absolument nécessaire pour la nation de manière générale.
Here's the million-dollar question, Genie. How do you maintain quality and yet cut costs? Some say it's impossible.
Defenders of France's fonctionnaires warn of chipping away at the system too much, as that could lower the standard for public services.
And then there's the fact that France's population is getting bigger and growing older. How can you answer the needs of an expanding population if you're cutting staff?
And even if you are cutting staff, you're still going to need to hire people anyway from the private sector, for example, or by outsourcing.
And some say that it's precisely the status of fonctionnaire that guarantees the caliber and integrity of public services. If you hire employees based on merit and with a job for life, well, you avoid nepotism, corruption, and political pressure. It's a stable check on the government.
In any case, it's a very complex issue that's sure to be on the agenda for many years to come. That's all the time we have for this show. Thanks for watching. Don't forget, if you have your own questions, you can always send Flo a tweet at Flo Villeminot.
And we'll see you next time for another episode of French Connections Plus.
Hello, I'm Annette Young, the host of the 51%, and in this week's special edition, we're coming to you from the Ethiopian capital of Addis Ababa. 1 year ago, this country appointed its first ever female president.
Today in Ethiopia, it's possible for women to achieve what others have achieved.
But in a nation still ridden with ethnic rivalry and with much of its population facing deeply entrenched poverty, just how far can this government go in order to truly advance gender equality?
The 51%, presented by Annette Young on France 24 and France24.com.